Good evening and welcome to this special election night broadcast of Mason Cable News. My name is Orlando Cabrera.
And my name is Jacob Pritchard.
Today, people across the Commonwealth of Virginia voted for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and the House of Delegates. Virginia is one of two states with gubernatorial election tonight, the other being New Jersey.
In the governor's race, the candidates are former Governor Terry McAuliffe, who is running under the Democratic Party, former businessman Glenn Youngkin, who is running under the Republican Party, and activist Princess Blanding, who is running under the newly formed Liberation Parties. Analysts and pollsters are predicting a very close race between Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin.
In the lieutenant governor's race, current Democratic delegate Hala Ayala will face former Republican delegate Winsome Sears. Attorney General Mark Herring is also facing a challenge from Virginia delegate Jason Miyares in the Republican Party.
This election also features all 100 members of the Virginia House of Delegates up for election or re-election. Democrats currently hold a majority with 55 seats and hope to defend their majority. This is the first time they've held a majority in the House of Delegates since the year 1999.
After a change to Virginia elections law last year, voters had the option to vote by mail or in person until October 30th.
Early voting turnout has been at an all-time high in the state of Virginia due to restrictions on voting being eased by the Ralph Northam administration over the past 4 years. Let's turn it over to Meg, who got the chance to talk to students as they were leaving the polls to find out why they came out to vote today.
All right, so did you vote here at Mason today?
Yeah.
And how was your experience?
It was cool. I'm actually an out-of-state student, so Mason is one of the only places I've been registered to vote since I turned 18, so it's always a good experience.
All right, and were there any lines when you were in there?
No, so I came early to
Oh,
get it
cool.
done.
So went in, voted, everything went nice and easy?
Yep.
What inspired you to register to vote in Virginia?
Well, like I said, I'm an out-of-state student, so, just being in Virginia and, it's just convenient and in the area is D.C., so it's always cool to get involved with the politics around here.
Where did you come from?
Connecticut.
Oh, okay. There's definitely a strong Connecticut to D.C. pipeline.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, do you have a message for other students about voting?
Just go vote.
Okay. Can you tell us why you voted?
Yeah, so voting is the most important thing that we could do in order to represent our democracy and do something and make changes in the world. If everyone in America voted, we would have a completely different set of people representing us, and honestly, in my opinion, be in a better place all around.
How was your voting experience in there?
It was awesome. Great time, very nice people. It's a little strange voting on campus as someone who also lives on campus because I never know what address they're looking for, but they're very nice and friendly and willing to work with me to make sure I got the right information.
Have you voted before, or was this your first time?
I have. I voted before. I voted every year since 2018 at least, if not before that as well.
How did it go?
It was pretty solid. I knew from the get-go who I wanted to vote for, campaigned for him happily. Youngkin runs on Virginia, so what can I say?
Did you get through the lines easily enough?
Yeah, it was pretty efficient. Nothing too bad.
And what inspired you to come vote today?
The fact that we need a change in Virginia. That's been, the cause since day one. Messaging's been pretty solid, so without a doubt, yeah, Youngkin.
Can you tell us why you came out to vote today?
Yeah, so I'm registered here on campus because I'm an out-of-state student, but I changed my registration to Virginia because everyone is saying that this is a tight election, and I really want to help keep Virginia blue.
Great, so where did you come from?
Arizona.
And is this your first time voting?
No, I've been voting since I turned 18. So I think my first election was maybe a local election, and then my second election was the presidential primary.
Okay, great. Is there anything you want to say to other student voters?
It's super important to vote. It's a civic duty, and since you can do it, you might as well. And if you're on campus, it's super easy.
What brings you out to vote?
I believe politics is important, as I can put it most eloquently. So I came here to perform my civic democratic duty as a citizen of a democratic country.
Is this the first time you voted?
It's not the first time I voted, and hopefully not the last time I'll vote.
Did you have any trouble getting through the lines?
No, it was pretty easy, basic, simple. I just walked down here, I went over to the voting place and I was able to walk right in after showing my ID and everything.
Do you have anything to say to Mason voters?
Politics is kind of dumb and confusing, but politics is important.
Can you tell us who you're with today?
I'm Joe Szymanski. I'm the second vice chair of the George Mason College Republicans.
All right, and what are you guys doing out here today?
We've got our little table and booth up there set up, trying to convince the few amount of university and college level Republicans that we can today to come out and vote for the great ticket that we have of Glenn Youngkin, Winsome Sears, and Jason Miyares.
And what have you done to get people ready for Election Day?
You know, we've done a lot of turnout procedures ourselves. We've done a lot of canvassing. We've tried to make sure every week, whether it be through phone banking on Tuesdays or going out and canvassing on Saturdays, we've been trying to make sure we get our people energized, that we know these races are happening in the area, and that they know here on campus, if they're registered to vote on here, then they make sure they're coming out and voting. So that way, all the hard work we put in can, be, done.
Great, and what's the main issue for voters today, do you think?
You know what? I think education and the economy are probably the two most. We've got a struggling economy right now with the inflation level at heights it hasn't been in a long time, and I think education has become really a surprisingly strong and salient issue along the lines here. I think it's really interesting to see how much that affects voters for today.
Is it looking like a close race?
I think it definitely is going to be. I don't think it'll be more than 2 points either way. If you would have told me a month ago that would have been it for Republicans, I would have been stunned, but I'm happy that we're here today and that we've really got a chance to show that Virginia can still vote for Republicans and we'll have a great Republican administration going forward.
What do you think the chances are of split tickets?
I think a chance of split ticket is actually very high. I don't even think necessarily people splitting their tickets. I think we're just going to potentially see a big undervote today. People will vote for the gubernatorial candidate, but they might pass on voting for everything else on the bottom of the ticket. I think an undervote is possible, and I think with how close everything is, that could lead to some real interesting results, I think, tonight.
Can you tell us who you're here with?
So I'm out here with the Gmu Democrats.
All right, and who are you guys pushing for today?
We're really pushing for Terry McAuliffe, Hala Ayala, and Mark Herring, but of course David Bolivar as well.
He's the state rep for this area?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, and what do you think is the most important issue today?
Probably the most important issue in the last few weeks of the race has been reproductive rights, mostly because the recent law in Texas has really kind of raised the salience of that in the race.
All right, and what are you doing to get voters out today?
So we are out here, and as people come in, we're asking if they're going to vote, and we're handing them sample ballots and telling them how to vote, what address they need to give if they're asked, that kind of thing. But we also have a group of people down at Southside who are reminding people that today is election day, and we've got signs all over campus, and we had chalk until it started raining that reminded people of that and had our candidates on it.
And what have you done leading up to today to get people out here?
We've been making phone calls, knocking doors all over the Commonwealth. I've been making phone calls mostly up in the 67th District for Carrie Delaney.
Is it looking like a close race?
It's going to be a really close race. Control House of Delegates is going to be very close. I think Terry's going to win, but I think it's going to be close. Same for the other statewide.
What do you think the chances of split tickets are this year?
I don't think we're going to see a lot of split tickets. We didn't really see many in 2020, and I don't think that's going to change.
Can you tell us what brought you out here today?
Sure. I came to vote today. I dropped in my absentee ballot, but I just didn't get the time to mail it in, so I just used the drop box in there.
Where are you voting?
George Mason University.
Sorry, you said your absentee ballot. Where is your absentee ballot from?
From Richmond, Virginia. I just moved on campus, so it was from different places.
Okay, great. Is this your first time voting?
Yes, it is. It's the first election I've been eligible to vote for.
And how was your experience inside the poll?
It was good. It was quick. I just dropped it off, and they had another interview in there for me. Everyone was nice, and it worked out well.
Great. Thank you so much. So what would you say to Mason students about voting?
I would say it's pretty important. It's just about the only way for college students to get their word across, get their literal vote in, and it's very important. So, yeah.
Thank you to Meg Thornberry for that excellent reporting. And thank you to the people of the city of Fairfax who were willing to speak to us today, as well as to the Mason students who were willing to speak to us today. We are now joined by Brad Byrne, who writes for the Fourth Estate. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, so happy to be here. I'm more than happy.
So what do you do for the Fourth Estate?
So I have been a staff writer for the news section ever since I was a freshman, and this is my third year. And today I was tasked with leading our election coverage, so thought why not come on here and speak about it.
Well, that's incredible. So what are you seeing today in the exits and as it stands in the results that we've shown so far? I see we have about 65% of the election day vote in, about 18% of the in-person early, and 7% of the in-person of the early mail vote. What are you seeing in that? Who is staying steady, or are we seeing an upset anywhere?
Well, for me, I've lived in Fairfax County for 20 years, and it's definitely a weird feeling for this election because we have been kind of trending in a blue direction, and they've been saying Virginia has been a purple state since 2008, and I'm honestly just looking at the results. It's going to be a very, very close call, with especially the early in-person votes and the early by-mail votes. I think we really have to wait for all of that to come in before calling any of these races.
And so you've been writing. You're a journalist. How much of this is, as we saw back in 2020, a red mirage around the Republican vote, which came in mostly in person on the day of, and how much of this is actual momentum for Glenn Youngkin do you see so far?
Well, I think we all kind of expected Youngkin to be getting the election day votes, but I wouldn't count McAuliffe out yet, because based on 2020, we had states like Michigan and Wisconsin that we had to wait days for because of absentee ballots. So I think we really just have to sit back. It's going to be a long night. I'm not sure the election will be called tonight. We'll have to just see what happens.
Do you believe it'll be days, or do you think that this is maybe going to come in a little earlier, or are we expecting more of that pandemic sort of a wave by wave vote count?
Well, right now I'm looking at it, and it says we have 81% of the expected vote in from NBC. So I think by this time tomorrow, we'll have a definitive picture of what's actually been happening for this election.
And we were also wondering, how are some notable regions like Central Virginia, Northern Virginia, and Hampton Roads looking at the current election output right now?
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch, because Chesterfield County, which is south of Richmond, which flipped to Biden in 2020, has flipped back to the Republicans with Youngkin, which, I know that it's been a Republican-based county before 2020, but I think that's just interesting to see who's flipping and who's not.
We've seen this dichotomy in Virginia throughout time, right?
Yeah.
There in most of Virginia, there's that conversation of there's Nova and then there's Rova. There's Northern Virginia and the rest of Virginia. Is this, do you think, a question of that? Is this that people in what would be considered the rest of Virginia feel ignored, or do you believe that this is more of a question of recent campaign tactics, or do you believe that this is more that the numbers just aren't where Democrats thought they were?
I think it's mostly the last point, especially with Loudoun County in Northern Virginia. There's been a lot of protests at the school board meetings there, and it was a sanctuary for Biden for 2020, and the lead for McAuliffe has fallen off from what Biden got. So what I'm basing this off of is that, yes, we know most of Virginia, except for Northern Virginia, will have that red mirage, but McAuliffe just isn't performing as well as he needs to in these Northern Virginia areas, which is really hurting him right now.
Speaking of President Biden, we've seen this nearly sluggish rollout of the infrastructure package and the budget, and of all of these social policies and human infrastructure. Do you think that the infighting within the Democratic Party is playing a major role in this as well, or is this Virginia specific?
I think that there is some infighting a little bit, but to go back to the Build Better bill, I think if that had been passed before this election, it would have pushed the Democrats a little bit more. But unfortunately, that has been held up and is still held up in Congress right now.
And we were also wondering how turnout in Northern Virginia specifically, as you said, it's a strong place for Democrats, Obama onward. And we're wondering how does that turnout look in comparison for McAuliffe and these other past elections?
Well, let's see. It looks like for Fairfax County, it's still, the Democrats running it up like they did with Biden, but I'm especially looking at Loudoun County, where it's two halves. There's one half which is more rural, and there's one half that's more urbanized, and I think you're really seeing that whole dichotomy tonight in Loudoun County.
The last few weeks of this campaign have been very heavy on critical race theory, which, for the record, for anybody watching, is not actually taught in Virginia schools, but has been a hot point, a flashpoint for Republicans across the country. And specifically, we've touched on a book lately, Beloved, by Nobel Prize-winning author Toni Morrison. It's existed for 45 years. But it seems to have hit a point where it is the center of this critical race theory argument. Why do you believe that education has taken, and in particular, theories and writings that have been around for this long are taking a hit in a race for governor? This seems like a culture war Donald Trump kind of argument, not like a Glenn Youngkin who's trying to run as the moderate for Virginia argument that we've been that we've been hearing from him outside of the occasional cozying to the endorsements.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Virginia. I went to Fairfax County Public Schools. I didn't learn critical race theory, and I can tell you that it's not being taught there. But I think just the rhetoric of saying it over and over again through other news sources, and people keep watching it, and they think, what is my 5-year-old actually learning? And I think it's getting these parents scared. And when you have scared parents, it never usually turns out well. So I think my understanding from this is just strong rhetoric has put this idea in the people's heads, and it's definitely, playing out in this election just from looking at the results so far.
And what specific things do you think we've seen so far that McAuliffe isn't doing as well as he had expected? And what specific things do you think his campaign, aside from Youngkin's campaign, could have ran on better or ran on that caused issues for their campaign, whether that be rhetorically, policy-wise, or whatever it may be?
I think one thing is that, McAuliffe, he's done this job before. Maybe people want someone new in this role. And I think one mistake I've seen with McAuliffe is that, you're running against Youngkin, you're not running against Trump. And I know that Trump is, his impact still is through the political landscape of America. But, Youngkin has sort of adopted a more moderate campaign in recent months, and that's definitely hurt McAuliffe, I would say.
And I think I'm not sure exactly where we are right now, and whether we have a lot of time for this, but I would like to know, in our and just moving back to the polling portion of this
Mm-hmm.
race.
I think just the
With regard to
I think just like in general.
early by mail and early in-person votes, are we seeing an outperforming and underperforming versus 2020? Are we seeing an outperforming and underperforming versus 2017? What are you seeing over the course of your reporting today?
Well, I actually did vote early this election, but you know, with early in-person voting, you do expect the Democrats to be ahead in that. And as I'm looking at it right now, according to NBC, there's 18% in right now. McAuliffe is leading 55% to 45% for Youngkin. So, I mean, I do think once we get more of these votes in, it'll give us a clearer picture of who's actually ahead in this election, because just during this interview right now, the numbers have been, they've been dwindling a little bit for Youngkin and going up a little bit for McAuliffe based on those early in-person votes.
And let's say that Glenn Youngkin wins tonight. Where are we looking for a split ticket between Youngkin, Ayala, or McAuliffe and Sears?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a weird situation if that ends up happening. And I think if that ends up happening, it's definitely a wake-up call for 2022, because midterms are right around the corner. And if the Democrats lose in a state that Biden won by 10 points, I think they really have their work cut out for them for this next election.
Wonderful. Well, Brad Burns, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
And we appreciate that. Right now, we are looking in New Jersey at Democratic incumbent Phil Murphy, who is running against his challenger, Jack Citarelli, for governor. This would be the first time that a Democrat won re-election in New Jersey in 44 years for the governorship. Also running in this race in third parties are Greg Mealy in the Libertarian Party, Madeline Hoffman in the Green Party, and Joan Konyansky from the Socialist Workers Party, who all have long shot bids.
New Jersey will also be holding state Senate and General Assembly elections. Democrats currently hold a 25 to 14 majority in the Senate, while holding a 52 to 28 majority in the General Assembly. Republicans hope to chip off the Democrats' majority, as Democrats hope to expand it, again in a long shot bid.
Another notable race tonight is in New York City, where incumbent Mayor Bill de Blasio is term limited. Former NYPD Captain Eric Adams is running against citizen activist Curtis Sliwa, and they will face off to become New York's next mayor tonight. By the way, we do have a call there, and it is that Eric Adams has won the mayoral race for New York City and will be serving in that office for the next 4 years.
Other notable mayoral races within the United States today are Atlanta, Boston, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Detroit. Also notably, Minneapolis is holding a referendum today on whether to replace their police department with something new.
Alexandria also has a mayoral race. Incumbent Mayor Justin Wilson was facing a challenge from Republican Annetta Catchings, and we will have the results on that in just a moment. And then more updates with results will be coming soon through MCN, and we hope you'll stay tuned. MCN's news director, Jack Dunne, had an opportunity to speak with Professor Jeremy Mayer from the Schar School of Public Policy to discuss the election and its possible outcomes. We'll tune over to that now.
Hi, my name is Jerry Mayer, and I'm a professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government, where I'm a political scientist who studies elections and public opinion and a bit of foreign policy, and I've been following Virginia politics for most of my life.
My first question is what do you think the biggest issue of this upcoming election is going to be?
So in the race between McAuliffe and Youngkin, I think the biggest issue of all is still Donald Trump. That the people who are for McAuliffe and the people who are for Youngkin are responding to the national tide. And that wasn't the case for most gubernatorial elections in American history. They were influenced by national tides, particularly in Virginia, for reasons we can talk about, but they weren't dominated, except in rare circumstances, by national tides. But we see declining rates of split ticket voting. Used to be very common in Virginia in particular for someone to vote Democratic for the governorship and Republican at the national level for the presidency. There's fewer and fewer people like that. So as much as these guys are talking about, in the case of Youngkin, critical race theory or parental control of schools or anti-mask mandates, and as much as McAuliffe is talking about abortion and the things he wants to do on Medicaid and other issues in Virginia, it's really going to be national issues, particularly those surrounding Donald Trump.
Yeah, I kind of feel like this election is becoming a little national because it's only one of two elections or two gubernatorial elections that are happening this year, the other being New Jersey, and this race is a lot closer. So I suspect that might be some of why
And that's the way it is all the time, though. Every 4 years, right after the election of a new president or the re-election of an old president, we look to these off-year elections in New Jersey and Virginia as reliable bellwethers of the national mood, or at least some indicator of the national mood. And as you know, or you probably know, the Virginia one usually has a counter effect to the immediately preceding election. So whoever wins the presidency, that party tends to lose the governor's race in Virginia. It hasn't always happened, but since Virginia became a two-party state, it's been fairly common for that to happen.
Yeah, I remember reading something that said like 10 of the last 11 governors the party in the White House has lost the gubernatorial election, and the one exception being in 2013 when Terry McAuliffe himself won. And I thought that was kind of interesting. So like if he were to win if he were to win on November 2nd, he would be the second governor to break that streak, the first being himself. So I think that would definitely be interesting if that were to wind up being the case.
Yeah, and here are the excuses that both parties have if they lose on November 2nd. If the Republicans lose, they can say, hey, it's Virginia. Virginia's a purple state that's trending blue. We had the ground set against us. We haven't won a statewide election since 2009. If the Democrats lose, in Virginia, they're going to blame it on Biden and the leadership in Congress for failing to pass the infrastructure bill, which would be very popular in Virginia, failing to pass the budget bill, which would be popular in Virginia, and also just failing. You know, Biden's approval rating, he's underwater. More Americans disapprove of his handling of the presidency than approve of it. And he is not helping McAuliffe as much as he could be if he were, say, 5 or 10 points more popular.
Yeah, and I also saw had something that had said that like Biden's approval rating has been lower than every other president's approval rating except for Trump's. Like it's still higher than Trump's approval rating was at this point, but it's still relatively low.
Yeah, it's rare for presidents to get this low this early in their presidency, and that's because of the historic thing that began with FDR, which is called the honeymoon period, where for the first 3 to 6 months of your presidency, particularly in your first term, you get a gift of approval from some members of the opposition party, and your own party loves you because you just won a national election. As events happen, as you make mistakes, as you get blamed for things that may or may not be your fault, it's just natural for presidents to decline, particularly with the opposition party. But one thing about our polarized moment is there's fewer and fewer people from the other party willing to give 1 day to an incumbent of the other party. So there were people on the other side when Obama was first elected saying, all right, he's president, let's see how he does. But there were a lot fewer a few years later when Trump was inaugurated, and maybe fewer during Biden, although Biden did get a honeymoon, Trump didn't.
That's true. It's because Biden's approval rating kind of started to dip in August. I also have my second question is, what do you think turnout will be like?
Well, Virginia is a state that historically doesn't want high turnout in its governor election. They schedule these off-year elections when they could do it even years. They could do it with the midterm congressional elections. They could do it with the presidential year elections like most states do. Why does Virginia have off-year elections? Because the aristocracy that created these elections didn't want poor whites voting, let alone poor blacks. So whatever the turnout will be, it'll be far lower than it would be if we did it like other states do. That said, I think turnout is the ball game because of that polarization that we mentioned earlier. And that's one of the reasons why the Republicans are more confident. It is more motivating in this hatred-filled moment in American politics to vote against than to vote for. And so when Democrats are thinking about voting, they have to think, oh, I will be supporting McAuliffe, I'll be supporting Biden. They're not as much voting against Trump because he's not in office. Whereas the Republicans have that white-hot rage that's been building. Many of them believe falsely that the election of 2020 was stolen.
Yeah.
But a huge majority of them believe that Joe Biden is a bad president. And they want to say how unhappy they are. And that motivation may well explain a higher turnout among Republicans. Overall, I would expect this turnout to be higher than the last gubernatorial election in Virginia.
Yeah, like, 'cause I had also read something a couple days ago that said that that the past couple governor's elections, the turnout rate has increased a little bit in comparison to the previous election, like still significantly down, but because I saw in like 2009, like the governor's election was like down nearly 50% from Obama's 2008 election, but the 2016 or the 2017 governor's election was only down like 34% from 2016. Like, do you think like the trend will kind of continue to go up? Like maybe it would be down like 25-30%?
I think that's likely. And it's because as people get angrier and angrier on both sides, they are more willing to vote more often. And so it will still be lower than a presidential year, but it'll be higher than 2017.
Yeah. Okay. And my third question is, how many people do you think will vote early?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it'll be significantly less than 2020, but early voting tends to favor, in the last few elections, tends to favor Democrats. Historically, early voting helped Republicans because many of the elderly took advantage of it, and that's particularly true if we include absentee voting in early voting. Right now, I would say early voting helps Democrats, and we'll see how well they did. I don't have a reason to have a prediction about that.
Yeah. I guess also another question is like, how early could we expect results?
So in this era of lawyers getting involved in every somewhat close election, I mean, let's face it, the 2020 election wasn't all that close in the Electoral College. It certainly wasn't that close in a number of states that were litigated by the Trump team, who delusionally thought or malfeasantly thought that they were stolen. They still litigated it. So Youngkin may well, if he loses, choose to litigate this, even if it's a 2% or 1% margin, which is a pretty clear statewide victory. However, if it's at all closer than 1%, we might not know for days because both sides will be looking very carefully at any questionable ballots. That's just the world we live in today. So if we see Youngkin winning by 3 points, if McAuliffe wins by 5 points, I think we will know pretty early on. The question is always with Virginia statewide elections is, by how much does the Democrat come out of Northern Virginia? What is his margin? And there's reason to think Youngkin could cut into that margin. And then the other is with what margin does the Republican come out of the rural areas of Virginia, Tidewater, Shenandoah, all those parts. And then the third thing to watch early on is when the black areas outside of Northern Virginia come in. When the black vote in Hampton, the black vote in Petersburg and Richmond and Norfolk, when those votes come in, we'll see maybe the effect of having a black woman running on the Republican ticket for lieutenant governor. So there are reasons for the Republicans to expect to do well in places they haven't done well in the last 4 or 5 statewide elections, like the suburbs of Northern Virginia, like some black voters down near Norfolk, where Winsome Sears is from.
Yeah, but I mean, because like the Democrats also have a colored woman on their ticket. Like, I mean, that I feel like that might also help them a little bit too, or maybe not help in comparison to like some other votes, but like.
Well, in Virginia, as opposed to nationwide, the largest minority vote is the black vote.
Yes.
And Democratic candidates live or die on the black vote in Virginia. If they don't get 90% of the black vote, that's bad news. And what their lieutenant governor candidate, the Republican, has shown is that sometimes she can get a significant portion of the black vote when she runs. So the woman she's running against is not black. And she may do well among people of her ethnic background, which is a diverse ethnic background.
Yeah.
There's just nowhere near as many of them as there are black voters in Virginia.
Reporting now, we can bring you some results from today's election. Here in Virginia, between Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin, we can see a 47.3 to 52% race, with Glenn Youngkin ahead by almost a full 5 points. Princess Blanding, the Liberation Party candidate, is running with about 0.7% of the vote. At this point, I can bet we're going to eliminate her from this election. So I'm going to say that that Glenn Youngkin holds a lead, but it is at this point both too close and too early to call. In New Jersey, Phil Murphy is cutting into Jack Citarelli's lead. At present, that is running at between 51 and 49% of the vote. Phil Murphy is making his way back up and is likely to win, but that is also both too close and too early to call, with only about 8% of the vote in.
In the city of Alexandria, we can confidently say that Justin Wilson has won his election bid for mayor of the city. Going up north, in Pittsburgh, Ed Gainey has become the first black mayor in the city's history. He is a Democratic candidate.
Now, joining us live from here remotely is Jack Houston, who will speak to us. He is an editor for Mason Votes, and he is joining us right now. Jack?
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Just watching the results come in. I'm over at the JC right now.
Wonderful. So you're in the Johnson Center. So I had a few questions for you. You're on the Mason Votes editorial board. What has that experience been like for you?
It's been a really good experience. We sort of get to reach out into different topics. We obviously talk about the elections, but we also got to talk about different topics that affect politics. And it's overall just been a good experience. I like to write a lot, so this is an outlet for that.
Now, you're on the subject of that, and as well, just talking about your writing and also your activism. You're a proponent of ranked choice voting. How has the reaction been that you've been hearing from Mason students and others about this race, and what do you believe might be some reforms or changes to Virginia's election system that would help in either evening the playing field or giving voters a greater say in their governance?
Well, so first of all, and this applies, to the country as a whole, especially to young people, and then, obviously to Mason students as well. But people, they want more choice in elections. Ranked choice voting is my preference, but there are other solutions as well. I know there were a lot of articles that came out previously when we thought this race was going to be a little bit closer, talking about how maybe Princess Blanding would take 2%, and that would prevent Terry McAuliffe from getting into the governor's mansion. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case, but that does happen in a lot of other elections.
Wonderful. Let's talk about the race itself. So we're looking at a race where Republicans are really looking for their sweet spot. We're no longer in a place where Trumpism is the only or only possible solution for Republicans, and where moderation only wins so much support from the base. So have we found that perfect recipe for the Republican victory in Glenn Youngkin's moderate sometimes, courting the Trump vote and Trump himself at other times approach to this race, or are we seeing are we seeing a new kind of Republican show up altogether?
Well, I think it really comes down to the state and to the voter base. In Virginia, I don't think there was ever a chance that any really, really far right candidate was going to win. If we had Amanda Chase win that election or win the GOP's convention, I don't think we'd be seeing what we're seeing now. And this goes to ranked choice voting, as the GOP used ranked choice voting for their convention. But I really think that, like you said, sort of a moderation while still, I don't want to say pandering, but, reaching out to the voters that are on the right, I think that's going to be a winning strategy for Republicans going forward. And if they utilize it in 2022, I think it's going to be pretty easy for them to take to win in the midterms.
And you brought up Amanda Chase, and this is an interesting kind of dichotomy in the party, where Amanda Chase has held a lot of the support from the Trump wing of the party and continues to hold that support, even in vast conspiracies, including not believing in the 2020 election for the presidency, not believing that if Glenn Youngkin loses this time, that it will have been rigged against the Republicans. If Glenn Youngkin wins, how does he hold that part of the party at bay?
Well, I think he's going to be able to say. So, for one, we should point out that earlier in the year, Amanda Chase was censored on a pretty bipartisan basis, if I remember correctly. So I don't think she had a ton of influence over the Virginia GOP as a whole. She definitely was the leader of that Trump wing, though, by far. But I do think that Glenn Youngkin and more of the moderate candidates, they're going to be able to say this is a winning strategy. We can campaign like this. We can reach out to other groups that we might not have been able to reach out to under Trump because they just have no interest in Trumpism and that sort of ideology. So as someone who's more moderate, I hope that's the way that the GOP goes. I don't know if that would work in, say, Texas or any of the other states that are, a little bit further right.
And do you think overall that the Republican Party within the United States has recognized that a lot of people in the United States aren't a huge fan of the more right-wing, more populist message of the Republican Party, and that Glenn Youngkin may symbolize a coalescing of that wing, saying that we want moderates who reject that, basically, and Glenn Youngkin, people that run the same messages and rhetoric he does?
Well, I don't know if they're outright going to reject Trumpism. We obviously have, the group of 10 congressmen that voted to convict Trump. I don't see anything like that happening from the party as a whole as a result of this. What I do think we'll see are people, campaigning with Trump at arm's length, not disavowing him, but also not really looking for his endorsement. And then I also think, and this is one of the mistakes that I think that the McAuliffe campaign made, is that they're really going to focus on these on these, like local issues like schools, and those sort of things, or like the gas tax, or I think the grocery tax. I'm sorry, that I saw Youngkin putting ads out about. I think it's going to be less about issues like building a border wall, and that sort of stuff, and more about these local issues.
Now, we've spent a lot of tonight talking about the Republican Party and the Republican Party's infighting. We've been seeing a lot of infighting in the Democratic Party as well, and we've seen a lot of a lot of wishful thinking since the California recall. Do you think that Democrats claiming in a lot of cases, victory right after the Democratic recall in California, the rejection of that recall, just before this Virginia governor's race, and what do you think is the Democrats' next move after this? I mean, we're not seeing an outstanding turnout for Democrats so far. That could change as the results come in tonight. But we're not seeing that mobilization and that enthusiasm that we saw in the public health debate that Gavin Newsom was having in California. We're not seeing it in the anti-Trump rhetoric and the anti-Trump actions of the Joe Biden candidacy that became the Joe Biden administration. What are Democrats not seeing, or what are they not what are they not reflecting on in this election that they need to be to keep a state like the Commonwealth of Virginia?
Well, I really think they needed to have focused more on the issues that Virginians care about. I personally, the only ads I saw from McAuliffe were, talking about Glenn Youngkin being, pretty much Trump's twin. So I think that was mistake number one, and I think that was a pretty big mistake. The other mistake, I think, was the sort of gaffe that happened at one of the debates, and that was just kind of bad luck. I don't think Terry McAuliffe really meant that when he said that. But I think when it comes to the Democrats' strategy going forward, it's going to be difficult for them to align. The Democratic Party is extremely diverse when it comes to its ideologies. We've obviously seen that when it comes to the infrastructure bill debates. And I don't have the answer for which side that they should go with, whether they should go more progressive, whether they should go more moderate. I don't have that answer.
Yeah, and I mean, what I will say is, even with that debate happening, inside the Beltway, we see this debate every single day. We see the moderates versus the progressives. But what about people outside of the Beltway? What about people who aren't, GMU students just watching the news and getting, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post alert every day? They see three governing bodies, the Senate, Congress and the Senate and the House, and the White House sparring within the same party and not getting anything done. How does this stonewalling that it seems like two moderates are doing, injuring the Democratic chances not only for this race but 2022?
Well, so I think Manchin and Sinema, they sort of see themselves as preventing it. The way that I think that they're doing it is they idealize a Senate that no longer exists, a Senate where the filibuster wasn't used nearly as much as it is now, and they're also with a Senate that was probably much more moderate. I think they're both obviously pretty moderate when it comes to what they want in these packages that are put forward. But it's the way that I see it, and again, I'm a little biased towards this because I'm an independent. I support, a multi-party system. I just don't think that this is sustainable. I think that, a party like the Democratic Party has a lot of different ideologies within it, a lot of different demographics. And it's going to be, I think it will happen. I think that this infrastructure bill will get passed eventually, but it's just going to be extremely difficult, and it's going to hurt Biden's approval ratings until it does get passed.
And we were wondering if McAuliffe can reflect a lot of the toxicity in the Democratic Party, to where there's a lot of things about the Democratic Party that the populace doesn't like all too much, including, as we said before, the stalling of their party, the stalling of their program in the Senate and the House and the executive branch. And we're wondering if McAuliffe can be seen by voters as a reflection of those negative qualities. Maybe that's why he wasn't voted in this election. Well, he wasn't voted in, but he's not performing as well as he could or was projected to.
Well, so I definitely think that the results of this election are reflective of Biden's approval ratings. I think that, I think we'll be understanding that tomorrow, assuming McAuliffe doesn't win. And even if he does win, Virginia was a state that the Democrats won by 10 points last year. And I think that this infrastructure deal, Afghanistan, a lot of these issues that Biden's been having, I think voters are sort of taking that out on him. And they're feeling more comfortable with it since, even though Glenn Youngkin hasn't disavowed Trump by any means, he isn't really, pandering to him. And they see another option. They don't necessarily like some of these establishment politicians, which I think Terry McAuliffe is the definition of an establishment politician.
And coming back to Virginia and this debate that we're having over education. I'm sorry, that was my mistake. Sorry, coming back to Virginia with a national discussion that we've been having on criminal justice. Apologies. Today in Minneapolis, there's a vote going on a referendum to replace the police department with a public health department. And that has been a weak spot for Democrats over the last year. Everybody acknowledges, or most of us acknowledge, that there needs to be a reform to policing as it stands. And in Virginia, we've seen Terry McAuliffe take specific stands, against ending qualified immunity. But on a nationwide standard, Minneapolis has become the talking point for the Republican Party as to the end of, tough on crime politics within the United States. Do you think that outside factors like the Minneapolis vote have had a dramatic or even a noticeable effect on this race here in Virginia?
So I don't think Minneapolis specifically has. I don't think many people were looking at Minneapolis in this election, or Virginians were looking at it. But they were definitely looking at sort of police reform as a whole as an issue. I know a lot of Republicans who they see it as you're either anti-cop or you're pro-cop. There's no in between. And I think that a lot of the voices that are more, I guess, further left, that, abolish the police, all of these different groups, that call that, they get amplified a lot. I don't think that's where the majority of the country is. I don't think it's where the Commonwealth is. I think the majority of people, and we saw this, I think that the polls last year were that the Black Lives Matter protests were approved by like 70% of the country. I might be wrong on that. I think that's what it was. And I do think that there was room for, a reasonable debate on how to fix the system, but I think it got taken over by a lot of people that were, further right or further left, on each end of the spectrum, and it sort of hurt Terry McAuliffe, who was probably a little bit more in the middle.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jack Houston, for joining us tonight. We really enjoyed having you on. We enjoyed your insight. And now I'm going to throw it over to Jacob.
Right. Now Tom Alzio will speak to Kristen Wright, Director of Civic Engagement.
So I'm Tom Ozio for Student Media, and I'm covering the George Mason Election Day coverage today. I'm joined by Kristen Wright, the Director of Civic Engagement here at GMU. And I know you're involved with the Office of Community Engagement and Civic Learning. Thank you again for being here. I know we've talked, emailed back and forth. Thank you again.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, I was hoping you could maybe expand on your kind of role of being the Director of Civic Engagement, maybe kind of talk about the goals involved with this, the mentioned office that I just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thanks for having me today. So the goal of the Office of Community Engagement and Civic Learning, it's a pretty new office that launched sort of informally in August of 2019 and more formally with sort of growing staff and that sort of thing this fall of 2021. And really our goals are to provide students, faculty, and staff opportunities while they're at Mason to be able to engage really meaningful around topics like community engagement, civic learning, and be able to have experiences to do that with community partner organizations. Our goal of this work is really that students will be able to practice a lot of the sort of experiences and skills that go into being sort of a civically engaged member of a community, practice them while they're here at Mason, and really be prepared to do things like vote, participate in community organizations, get really involved in their areas as beyond their time at Mason, but to provide those kinds of opportunities to do that while they're here in ways that are also connected to their major, their academic learning, that sort of thing. So we really, that's the goal, is to provide those opportunities for students and be able to partner with faculty to make sure that it's also aligned with academic interests and career interests and that kind of thing.
Now you mentioned kind of getting students more involved in voting. I know your office has been involved with Mason Votes for the past few years. I was wondering if you can expand kind of on that experience of kind of getting students involved and you being involved in Mason Votes. How has this year changed from previous years, and just how has that experience been like overall?
Yeah, it's been a really cool experience. So we're lucky at Mason that our Mason Votes team is a really nice combination of folks from across campus. So we have student government, university life, student media, my office, and community engagement and civic learning. And so we're able to have a lot of different kind of focus areas covered when it comes to opportunities to encourage students to vote. Last year, because COVID hit and we were really in the midst of how do folks vote, we focused a lot on voter education and registration awareness around how to vote during a pandemic. We held some events that were really popular with students to think through what are the options, what are the safe ways to vote. We're really fortunate in a state like Virginia that a lot of voting rights have been expanded in that amount of time. So things like early vote, voting by mail, all of that, those options have stayed and even expanded for students. So there's so many different ways to be able to vote. We're really lucky at Mason to be able to have an on-campus voting location in Merton Hall for anyone who registers there. So we have a really, I think, rich dynamic at Mason when it comes to voter interest. We have a ton of students who are interested. We plan a lot of events and try to coordinate some of the large scale things like the visit from Vice President Harris for National Voter Registration Day. Mason Votes tries to make sure we're coordinating some of those, but we have a incredible energy from student groups and student organizations who coordinate a lot of events and watch parties and things like that too. So there's definitely a really engaged feeling on campus when it comes to issues of voter education, voter awareness, and voter registration.
Yeah, it's really good to hear, and the ease of being able to vote on campus is definitely a great opportunity. Now, I understand your office is kind of getting involved with faculty and kind of changing or guiding the curriculum to being more with civic engagement, and kind of the civil learning kind of has been added to different curriculum. I was hoping you could maybe describe what kind of curriculum has been added to courses, and I guess how do you view this kind of changing student civic engagement?
Yeah, great question. So our goal is really that students will have opportunities to see the way civic learning connects to their academic interests and their major. And so it's not large scale curriculum. It's really just working with faculty to develop ways that they can build into what they're already doing connections to civic learning. So an example is maybe an engineering faculty member hasn't before talked in their classroom about why an engineer should vote and what some of the connections between things like zoning laws, right, and the local officials that are elected, and your ability to do some of the public engineering kind of work that you may do in the future. And so really getting faculty members across their discipline areas to be able to bridge some of those connections. A lot of the research finds that students find those connections more meaningful when it comes from folks who are either doing jobs like they want to do or kind of are in their discipline or field or that sort of thing. And so that's really our goal, is to provide faculty with the tools to be able to make those curricular integrations. And so for students, it hopefully won't look like dramatic curriculum change, right? We're not trying to make extra classes or a ton of extra lift for students, but that it'll really seamlessly be embedded into classes they were already going to take, but start to make those connections between why it matters to be doing things like reading the news and knowing what's happening in your community. And really, I think in a year like this, it's important to underscore local elections, and it's not always just what's happening every 4 years in the White House, but a lot of the decisions that really are impacting you on a day-to-day basis are coming from local officials that are making rules in your town, your community, your city, that kind of thing. And so that's really, like I said, our hope is to be able to equip faculty with tools to make that sort of curricular integration. And so students can start seeing those connections early in their time at Mason.
Yeah, I think that's very beneficial. But one last question before we go. I know we're running up on time here. I was curious how students can what can students do like today or even this year to be just more involved in kind of their community and having these civic learning opportunities?
Great question. I think one important thing to do if you are not registered to vote is register to vote, and following some of the your local city elections, things that are happening. A lot of great work that happens in your communities for students is in neighborhood associations, community associations. So looking up, depending on where you live in the area, looking up what that group is. A lot of times those groups are engaged in conversations about what's happening in the community, but oftentimes in things like service projects, doing work to make sure to preserve kind of the area that they're living in, that sort of thing. Reading the news and reading it from a number of different sources just to make sure you're confirming the sort of validity of the different sources that you're reading and that kind of thing. And having conversations with friends, with colleagues, with family, with folks about what's happening in your community and different ways that you can get involved. I'm a big proponent of finding a local organization that you can volunteer with. And that's a really good way to both get connected to the community that you're living in, but also be able to do some good during that time. So those are, I think, a few quick things folks can do: register to vote, read the news, look up your local community association, and maybe find an organization to volunteer with.
Yeah, it's a lot of really good information. So those listening, you definitely, or those watching, should definitely understand. But thank you again, Kristen. You're the Director of Civic Engagement. Yeah, make sure those watching right now, make sure you get out and vote. It's always appreciative. But I'm Tom Mosio with Student Media for George Mason Cable.
And as we return to our results for this evening, we are still too close to call with about 79% of early in-person votes not counted, with approximately 33% of in-person day of votes not counted, and 93% of early mail-in votes not counted. We did want to take a look at George Mason University's exit polling, which will not be indicative of the entire state, but is a testament to the university itself and where we stand as we vote every year here in Virginia, in both state elections in the odd years and federal elections on the even years. So as we look at this data, Jacob, what are you seeing?
I'm seeing something notable with the age, to where a lot of the voters that interact with our exit poll on the campus were actually 18 to 19 years of age. That constituted about 41% of the voters that responded to the exit poll, with 30% being 20 to 21-year-olds. And again, a lot of it's freshman voting because of the 18-19 age range, with the majority, or I guess the plurality of class standing being freshmen at 22.7%. And it's also interesting because people tend to be less enthusiastic in a midterm election nationwide, that people had responded 42% that they were very enthusiastic about this election, and somewhat enthusiastic being 32% of people on the campus.
And that's really interesting, because you do see a lot of enthusiasm wane in off-year elections. If it's not a presidential election, we tend to see a very large dip in that. So where are we looking right now in the number of Mason students who voted overall?
Well, it looks like that's 95.3%, so great job, Mason. You did your job. And a lot of people voted from Mason in person on election day from our exit poll, where that constituted 81.8%, which is major because we had thought that a lot more people were voting in person earlier by mail early, but it seems that the vast majority here are still doing in person.
But that also does tell us something different, which is, between last year's election and this year's election, we are seeing a lot of maybe not the concern over COVID dissipating, but definitely, that belief in early mail-in voting being the primary way of our casting our ballot, kind of waning as people certainly not only feel more enthused when they actually punch the ballot in a voting booth, but also seeing that people are kind of coming back to life as normal. So what was the number one issue?
Well, the number one issue for George Mason students was actually social justice by a pretty large margin too, a plurality of 19.6%, which is interesting because George Mason is such a diverse campus to where those issues really pop for us because a lot of us experience them on a day-to-day basis. So, and then the thing that came up next, or the second most important issue for Mason voters, was our COVID-19 pandemic response within the state, which could be seen as a testament to people still caring about COVID and things like mask mandates and vaccine requirements and just stuff like that, to where those two issues show our school conscious in a way.
And I think we're about to move to reverse party colors, so bear with us on this. It doesn't look the way that it actually does.
Yeah.
But who did people vote for in the governor's races and the lieutenant governor's races here in Virginia?
Well, it looks that on the George Mason campus that every election was pretty overwhelmingly Democratic, which, it being in North Virginia and a student population as diverse as Mason's, not to be unexpected. McAuliffe won in George Mason by 82.5% as opposed to Glenn Youngkin's 13.3%. And if we look down at the lieutenant governor's race, Hillel won by 83.9% as opposed to Winsome Sears' 10.5%, which is notable because she's running ahead of McAuliffe, the head of the ticket. And
that's interesting as well, because we're about to talk about the Attorney General's race and also Hala Ayala. But Mark Herring is actually, out of all three of our statewide officers right now, running the highest, which is not necessarily normal. So out of the Democratic candidates, we're seeing preference lean between Mark Herring for the Attorney General, who has an 86% rating in our exit polling, but almost 48% right now in the report. And then we have Hala Ayala showing about 83.9% in our exit polling, and almost 47% in the polls. Also 48%. My apologies. But former Governor McAuliffe seems to be running a little bit behind both of those margins, which seems interesting and a little bit worrisome for Democrats. What say you to that? What say you to the fact that we're seeing down ballot races run a little bit higher up on the rung than our highest?
Yeah, so I think there's two things of note here. That Mark Herring is the incumbent here. He's the only one of the candidates that's running that's actually an incumbent in the office he's running for. This is going to be his third or fourth term?
This will be his third term, I think.
His third term. And the Hillel she's an inspiring candidate to a lot of people, perchance, where McAuliffe isn't. McAuliffe's been here for so long in this role before that maybe people want a change in the Democratic Party. And maybe they're just comfortable with incumbents being there. So it's interesting to see, because usually down ballot doesn't run above the front of the ballot. So it's just worrisome for McAuliffe that he can't unite his party in that way himself, and that he's relying on down ballot candidates per chance to boost him.
And Democrats, especially in local races, tend to, or not Democrats, but local officials tend to be Democrats in races where the locality includes a college or university. This is no different for David Belova, who is running with about 66% to 67% of the vote at present. How does that differ from our exit polling on the 37th District of Virginia?
Yeah, so for George Mason students voting at Fairfax and in this House of Delegates race for the 37th District, it's the closest between the two, between the actual vote and the Mason vote, to where we have 76.9% of people from Mason voting for the delegate, David Belova. It's very interesting to see how close those numbers are, and maybe it's a testament to how close Mason votes with Fairfax.
And kind of taking one final look at this exit polling, we did have a non-voting portion of our student body. So for the people who decided not to vote, what were the largest factors in that decision, in the decision of not participating in this particular governor's race?
Well, by a pretty large margin, it's actually not being eligible to vote. 71% actually. To where that can be from a multitude of factors. I'm assuming mostly because some people haven't turned 18 yet, because of how young college campuses can be at times. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. Also, some people forgot to register and some were too busy, which can be of note because sometimes Virginia can be pretty hostile towards elections, to where Mason, somewhat uniquely in public universities, didn't give us the day off to go vote, or a lot of professors didn't, and the university itself didn't, that could probably apply to the business factor. So it's interesting to see the reasons why people couldn't vote, and yeah.
So I'm going to run back to our results, and then we will be running into another interview. But at present, what we see tonight is that Glenn Youngkin is running with about 51.6% of the vote, and that's according to our source at the New York Times. And Terry McAuliffe has about 47.7% of the vote, with Princess Blanding coming far behind at 0.7% of the vote. This is still too close to call. This is still too early to call here in Virginia. We do have approximately 92% of the expected vote in, but the expected vote is not always the actual tally. So what we will be looking at now, because the majority of the election day votes are in, is going to be the early in-person votes and the early mail-in votes, which will play a significant role in deciding this election and who will live in the governor's mansion for the next 4 years. And now, Jacob, I think you have the honor of introducing our next segment.
I sure do. Next, Meg Thornberry had a chance to speak to a member of the Gmu Democrats, Bailey, while they were tabling outside of Merton Hall today.
Hi, I'm Meg Thornberry. I'm here with Mason Cable Network and Mason Votes. Today we're talking to Bailey, who is the political director with George Mason Democrats.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being out here today on this rainy Tuesday. Can you tell us what issue you think is most important to students today?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely would say access to education and access to healthcare is definitely very important to students, especially in the world we're living in right now with this whole pandemic going on. We've realized how important access to healthcare really can be for people, and that's something you see a lot of disparities in, especially with younger people not having access to healthcare necessarily per se. So I think that's an important issue for students, as well as equal access to education, lowering tuition rates, stuff like that. I think that's definitely top of the list for students, focusing on current issues going on in their lives.
And has that affected how you're voting this year?
Oh, absolutely. Personally, I come from a background with a lot of financial stress within my family, so having access to affordable education is something that's really important to me. So that's something I definitely want to advocate for, and I don't want tuition prices to go up at Mason more than they already have.
Have you already voted, or are you voting today?
Yeah, I actually voted early. I voted in my district back home because there's some more competitive races going on than the races up here, so I decided to do that, and I voted when I went back home to visit in the beginning of October.
Where's your home district?
I'm from a county right outside of Richmond. It's called Henrico County, so it's just a little more of a swing district over there, so it's better to vote there.
So what are some of the things you've been doing, some of the events you've been holding on Mason's campus?
Yeah, so we did voter registration all before the voter registration deadline back in early October, and we were outside of Southside, outside of Fenwick every single day registering students to vote so that they could have access and have a say in the election. And then we also have been doing a lot of phone banking and canvassing and text banking for all of the candidates running all throughout Northern Virginia, whether it's in the district that Mason's in or not. We also have been hosting our weekly meetings, and we've been making sure to advertise the election and voter registration and getting out the vote on campus all the time.
So what do you think turnout is going to look like today?
I'm hoping for really good turnout. We definitely did get a lot more people registered than we were hoping to, so that was really exciting to hear. So far it's looked pretty good. We've had a lot of students come out this morning, and people seem really eager to vote. So I think that's definitely going to be really beneficial to this election. However, hopefully that stays strong all throughout the state of Virginia today.
We've heard it's going to be a close race. What are you seeing on your end?
I agree with that personally. I think it is going to be a very close race. I think there's been so much that's happened recently that is causing people to really want to put their foot out there and have a say in what's going on in the world. So I do definitely see it being a close race. However, hopefully Virginia stays strong and stays blue.
Do you have any final words for Mason students who are voting either here or at home?
Yeah, absolutely. Just make sure that your voter registration is up to date, you know your address, you show up with proper identification, and most importantly, make sure to vote.
All right, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Meg, for the wonderful interview. Next, Ryan Patrice spoke with Brooke Sanderford, chairwoman for College Republicans at George Mason.
Hi, I'm Ryan Patrice, and I'm here today with Brooke, the chairman from College Republicans. Today, we're going to interview her and ask her some questions about the 2021 gubernatorial race. Let's get started. So, Brooke, what issue do you think students should focus on the most?
Right, I think within this election cycle, I think especially on a college campus, is free speech, especially in academia. I think a lot of times, you can get in spaces where only one view is prominent, and I think we should be creating spaces where everyone feels comfortable to share their beliefs, no matter, kind of what background they come from.
Now, what are you personally focusing on?
I'm personally focusing on kind of especially within this election cycle, rebuilding Virginia, especially outside of, this COVID atmosphere. We've seen a lot of kind of just the downturn of not only just every aspect of, the state. And so, really rebuilding and finding people and voting for people that are going to make that the number one priority is really important for me.
Yeah, I think it's important too. Now, have you voted early, or do you plan on voting on November 2nd?
So I recently just changed my voter registration from North Carolina to Virginia, and so I will be voting on November 2nd in Merton Hall. So I'm really excited to, be able to, participate at the university level.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the election night, do you think it's going to be a closer race?
I definitely think it's going to be a close race. I've been watching the polls, and I think the most recent poll had them tied evenly. So I think it's going to definitely be a close race, and just shows you the competitive nature of Virginia as a state.
Yeah. So I remember that our previous elections was a lot. So I want to ask you: do you think we'll get the election results that night, or do you think it'll take a few days?
So that's definitely hard to say. I think we're all hoping that, just with how much early voting we've been doing and kind of, people's just willingness to go out to the polls, that it will be on election night. But, seeing within the past year of just COVID, it's kind of, time will tell, I think, in this case.
Yes. So I know you're the chairman of the College Republicans, and I want to ask what your organization has done to promote voter registration and to encourage voting on campus.
Right, absolutely. So one thing that we did when we tabled for the club fair is we had registration forms for both out-of-state, in-state, and in-state students. And every single person that came to the table, we asked the simple question of, are you registered to vote? And it's kind of crazy because your college is one of those experiences where people are recently just turned 18 and they don't really understand how much of their voice matters. And so the one thing that we've pushed at every single one of our meetings and our group chats and our newsletters is, are you registered to vote? And if that answer is no, we always try to provide ways to get these people registered to vote.
Okay. Does College Republicans have they had any events recently?
Yes, absolutely. So our biggest focus right now is focusing on this election and also like statewide offices. So recently we just were door knocking in Richmond with the College Republicans National Committee. And so we were able to meet College Republicans from the entire United States, helping us door knock for the entire statewide ticket, as well as Delegate Roxanne Robinson. And so we were able to, be on the ground and door knocking within that district. But we've taken kind of the focus back onto campus. So we've been doing phone banking nights for delegates like, Otto Wasserman, and as well as even phone banking for Youngkin. So it's been a really great experience to kind of get people involved and show them that their work does matter.
Okay, speaking of events on campus, that actually leads me into my next question. Why do you think it's so important for college students in particular to vote?
I think it's important for college students to vote because as young people, our voice matters. And I think the misconception we have is, oh, my voice doesn't matter. Oh, I'm just here for college. And, the areas we choose to go to college shape us in a way. And so I think, it's fair for us to also shape them.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you for coming in and doing this interview today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us again, and thank you to Ryan Patrice for that incredible interview. And Jacob, you have some updates for us here in Virginia.
So with 94% of the vote in, looking at it, it looks like Youngkin is leading by 51.1% of the vote, while McAuliffe is leading by 48.1%, or trailing by 48.1%, my mistake. Well, looks like the numbers on here are a little bit different. So it's 50.7 for Glenn Youngkin and 48.6 for Terry McAuliffe, which signifies that the gap is being closed between McAuliffe and Youngkin to where it was a substantial gap of almost 8 points earlier in the night to where we've dipped it to about 2%. So it's it's interesting to see how this lead has shrunk.
So here in Virginia, we're looking at a relatively tight race. It's becoming what we always expected it to be. But what do you think it's going to take for either Terry McAuliffe to pull ahead or for Glenn Youngkin to make an inroads enough that he can claim a solid mandate for his governorship?
I think the key lies in North Virginia, to where I think Democrats throughout the state are disappointed in counties like Loudoun and Fairfax for maybe not getting out like they wanted them to, because Loudoun's results are a lot less democratically skewed than they were last time, and so is their overall turnout, to where I feel like if that turnout increases, or I guess the counted votes increases in Northern Virginia, that could be a way for Democrats to win the election. But if those numbers keep where they are now, Glenn Youngkin may win the election. And I think if we see the south of the state and Hampton Roads continue to go with Youngkin, that's going to create a good avenue for him if he wants to be elected.
And, at this point in the night, it may be a little bit too close to call, but what does it look like to you if we have a split ticket? Do you think that Republicans will also take the lieutenant governor's office and maybe not take the attorney general's office, or do you believe that we're heading towards one party leadership in Virginia still?
Well, I think if we're looking at it, the numbers that we're looking at right now for the lieutenant governor race is that Hialeah is trailing by 48.7%, while Winsome Sears is leading by 51.3%, to where we were checking earlier in the night, the lieutenant governor's race and attorney general's race were running behind McAuliffe, but now, from what we're looking at, McAuliffe's leading ahead, to where I feel if we're looking at it now, it may be, if it's going to split, it might be a McAuliffe victory and a Sears victory or a Jason Marare's victory, to where it's changed that way throughout the night. And as the numbers keep going in, we'll get closer to that. And speaking of the numbers, Mark Herring is still leading ahead of both Terry McAuliffe and Hialeah, where he is only trailing by about 1%, or about 1.5% at 49.1, where Jason Marare is winning by 50.9, to where he's still running ahead of both candidates, and that might be evidence that there is an incumbency bias within Virginia that's still very poignant.
Mm-hmm. And it's also worth noting, and just before we move on to our other results for the evening, that no matter what, tonight is going to be a historic night, or this election is going to be a historic election, primarily because in the lieutenant governor's office, whether it's Hala Ayala or whether it's Winsome Sears, we are going to have our first woman of color officer in a statewide office here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But I'd like to move on, and nationwide we're seeing races across the United States and elections across the United States on referendums in Minneapolis. The people of Minneapolis have rejected a referendum to disband their police department. They will not have a Department of Public Safety, and they will continue to be under the watch of the Minneapolis Police Department. In Boston, Michelle Wu will be the next mayor. And again, in case you were not with us earlier when we said it, in New York City, Eric Adams, a former police captain in the NYPD, will be the next mayor of New York after Bill de Blasio was term limited. But as we're looking for the rest of the night, we will also be keeping our eye on New Jersey, where Jack Citarelli is leading 51.6% to 47.6% over Phil Murphy, who is the incumbent governor. Phil Murphy will likely prevail. We have a Democrat expected victory in New Jersey. But for the moment, there is that red mirage, which we saw last year as well, in the same-day vote being significantly more Republican than the early in-person or the early mail-in vote. And we will continue to watch that race. But it is to be noted that that is both too early and too close to call. And at the same time, it should be noted that many of the major urban centers of New Jersey have not been counted yet. So that'll be an interesting race to watch. As for this evening, I believe that this will conclude our coverage of the races across the United States. And Jacob?
We wanted to thank you all for tuning in tonight, and if you want to keep up to date with news on and off campus, you can follow us on Instagram at MCN, on TV, Twitter, and Facebook at Mason Cable Network, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jacob.
And I'm Orlando. And have a wonderful evening, George Mason, and whatever happens next, we will have a governor, we will have a lieutenant governor and attorney general leading the great Commonwealth of Virginia.